Well, howdy there, folks, and welcome back to part 3 of our Chapter 5 lectures, where we're dealing with recruiting issues. You'll remember from 5A that we talked about the overall concept of recruiting and the kinds of things that influence how many folks we need to hire and how many folks we're able to hire, and some things in the economy and the external environment and those sorts of things that influence our staffing projections. And then we spend some time in 5B looking at some tools that we can use to try to figure out how many people we need. Some quantitative tools like ratio analysis and scatter plots and trend analysis, and some qualitative tools like judgmental forecasting. And then we spent quite a while talking about the concept of a transition analysis, and you'll remember that we worked through an example with the Braves, showing how folks move from one level of the organization to another, and at the end of the year how we might project based on historical trends how many folks that we would need to recruit or draft or trade for or whatever to maintain the level of staffing that we need throughout the organizational levels. And remember that doesn't just apply to situations where they're moving from one place to another geographically, but it also, and probably more frequently, applies to a situation where folks move between roles in a service organization, a customer service level 1, level 2, level 3, implementation, sales, management, those kinds of things. It's probably more frequently used in that context. But today we will, in this video, look at the third part of external recruiting, and we'll look at the actual process that we go through. And where we've looked in the past at the number of people we need to have at the end of the process, now we're going to look at how we calculate the number of people we need to have coming into the process to get the number of people coming out of it that we'd like to have. And we can think of it like perhaps a funnel where you've got a big opening at the top and a little opening at the bottom, and you want to get 2 or 3 through the bottom part. How many people have to come into the top in order to get 2 or 3 out the bottom, based upon how many folks make it through various stages of our process, traditionally and historically. And before we get into that, I want to get you to pause your video here and go look for a file that's in the content section that looks a little bit like this. It's called the Staffing Hiring Yield Worksheet. And we'll need that as we work through this particular lesson, so you can fill in the blanks and try to figure out how we mathematically can calculate the number of people that we need to get in the door in order to hire a certain number of people. So I'll pause here for a second while you go find that file and print it so that you can have it here on the desktop with you. All right, I assume that you have gotten that thing printed so far. So we'll start with external recruiting with a couple of definitions. First of all, the idea behind the video for today is trying to figure out how many people we should recruit, understanding that not everyone who is recruited actually ends up working for us, but we've got to have a bunch of people recruited in order to kind of sort through and find the best. And there's 2 definitions that I want you to remember. These are very important definitions for test purposes, so know the difference between the 2. We're going to talk in this video about staffing yields and hiring yields, and they're slightly different in their meanings or their applications. Notice that the staffing yields is the ratio, that's a typo on that slide, the ratios, not the ratios, established ratios of how many people move from one stage of the process to the next stage of the process. So for example, if our process says that we have people who come in and fill out an application, and we've got a block of those people, some of them get a first interview. So what is the relationship between those 2? Maybe we would say that 1 out of every 4 applicants gets an interview. That's a staffing yield, 1 out of 4. And that is related to that one stage of the process for that one job, for that one company. Understanding too that every job is different. So for a bank teller, it might be that 1 out of every 2 get an interview. For a manager's position, it might be the 1 out of every 10 get an interview. But the staffing yield, very simply, as we look at the various stages, maybe in our process from start to finish, from application to hire, there are 6 steps. So there's a staffing yield for the process of step 1 to step 2. There's another staffing yield which is different from the first one for the movement from step 2 to step 3. There's another one from step 3 to step 4, another from step 4 to step 5, and another one from step 5 to step 6. Each one of those is its own unique number, like 1 to 4 or 3 to 5 or 9 to 10. Out of every 10 we have 9 move forward. Out of every 4 we have 1 that moves forward. So understand that idea of a staffing yield. The ratio or percentage of people that move from one stage to the next. The hiring yield doesn't look at the individual stages, it looks at the starting point and the finish point. So the hiring yield is the proportion of people that we hire who finish the process as compared to the people who apply and who start the process. So comparing the end number to the start number. And that'll begin to make more sense as we look at the next couple of slides. Looking at it from the shape of a pyramid here, let's look at what this tells us from figure 5-6 in our textbook. We start from the bottom and we work up. Let's say that we have 2,000 applicants for a particular job. Obviously, we're a national company, very, very well respected. People want to work for us. We post a job and we have 2,000 people who apply. And let's say that the very first staffing yield is the relationship between applicants and first interviews or interview invitations, it says. Let's say that historically we find that 1 out of every 4 applicants gets invited to an interview. So if we have a 1 to 4 relationship, starting with 2,000, it means that 500 actually of those 2,000s, that's a 1 to 4 relationship, actually get an interview invitation. Well, now let's say that of those interview invitations that we send out, 4 out of 5 people who get those interview invitations actually accept it and agree to an interview. So 1 person out of every 5 who applied changes their mind. They no longer want to have an interview for whatever reason. They applied, but by the time we called them for an interview, they've gotten another job, they've decided to do something different, they've lost interest. But let's say, according to this particular example, that 4 out of every 5 people that we extend an offer to interview with, 4 out of 5 of them say yes. So if we started with 500 and we offered 500 people an interview, 400 of them said yes and actually showed up and did the interview. Now in real life, that's kind of crazy that we're going to think about interviewing 400 people, but just for mathematical purposes to help you understand the way this flows. So the staffing yield from step 1 to step 2 is 1 out of 4 or 25%. The staffing yield from step 2 to step 3 is 4 out of 5 or 80%. Now we've interviewed 400 people. We say historically for this particular job that 1 out of every 4 people gets a job offer. We interviewed 400, a 1 to 4 relationship means that 100 people got a job offer. So the staffing yield from stage 3 to stage 4 is 1 out of 4 or 25%. So now we've winnowed from 2,000 people who started down to 100. And tradition shows that of the people that we give a job offer to, 3 out of 4 accept it. So 1 out of 4 doesn't like the job offer, or by now they've gotten another job, their interests have changed, whatever it is. But 3 out of every 4 people that we offer a job to take that job. We started with 100 offers that we made, and 3 out of 4 of that means that 75 people accepted the offer. The staffing yield, therefore, from stage 4 to stage 5 is 3 out of 4 or 75%. So when we look at this process, we start with 2,000, we end up with 75. Because we have staffing yields of 1 out of 4 and 4 out of 5 and 1 out of 4 and 3 out of 4. So you notice that at each stage, as we move from stage to stage, it's a different staffing yield. 1 out of 4, 4 out of 5, 1 out of 4, 3 out of 4. And that would be different for this job as compared to another job. Maybe you understand now the basic concept of how people flow through our process and how we can predict how many people are going to make it from one stage to the next. But we can also use this information to answer a couple of other questions. One of those questions being, we want to hire 3 people, how many do we need to start with? The other question is, we've got 400 applicants, how many are we likely to end up with? And we can work the math from both directions. And that's what we're going to do with the little worksheet that I gave you and get some practice doing staffing yields. Now, be alert that you might have an example of this as a question on your test. It might be here's the situation, multiple choice test, multiple choice question, how many people end up if we start with this, given these staffing yields, or maybe it is how many of them, pick it out of A, B, C, or D, or maybe I actually have to ask you to calculate it on a piece of paper and fill it into the test bank. But let's look at the process here as we apply it to a particular job. Let's say that what we're trying to do here is to hire some bank tellers. And there are 6 steps in our hiring process. The first step is that somebody comes in and applies for a job. The second step is that from that pool of people who apply, we get some first interviews. The next step is that some of the first interview people come back for a second interview. The third step, or the fourth step, I guess, is that some of those people who have a second interview, we actually do a background check on. And of those background checks that come back, the fifth step is that we make some offers. And the last step is that of the offers that we make, some people actually become employees. So look at the 6 steps: the applicant, the first interview, the second interview, the background check, the offer, and the employment. Now let's assume that we have historically found, now again, you got to remember that we don't make these numbers up as we go. This is not wishful thinking or hoping that this is the relationship between the stages as people move. But over the course of the last 5 years, 10 years, whatever, over the course of the last 100 people we've hired, these are what we typically see as the relationships in our process. So let's say that as we look at Part B compared to Part A, that's the first stage of transfer in our hiring process. We find that for every 5 applicants, we get 1 first interview. So it's a 5-to-1 relationship as we compare B to A. As we compare then C to B, how many of the first interview people get asked back for a second interview? Let's say that traditionally we find that of every 5 people who get a first interview, 3 people get asked back for a second interview. So we're narrowing the pool a good bit already. And then we find traditionally that for every 4 people who have a second interview, we make 1 background check. So it's a 4-to-1 relationship. Then we move to the 5th stage. Of every 2 people who have a background check done, we have 1 job offer. And then the final stage is that for every 10 job offers we make, we have 9 people who become employees because they accept that offer. So we have relationships, staffing yields, of 1 to 5, and 3 to 5, and 1 to 4, and 1 to 2, and 9 to 10. Now, given those historic traditional numbers, can we then calculate how many people we need to start with to end up with a certain number, or can we calculate how many people we're likely to end up with if we start with a certain number? So we can work it forwards or we can work it backwards. Let's look at an example here of how this works. And let's say the situation is that we need to have 4 tellers. Given those historical relationships with our staffing yields, how many applicants do we need to get 4 tellers? Here's where we're going to use our worksheet. Let's say that, remember, we have these stages of our hiring process: an applicant, a first interview, and that's 1 out of 5, a second interview, which is 3 out of 5, a background check, which is 1 out of 4, an offer, which is 1 out of 2, and an employee, which is 9 out of 10. Now we know that we want to end up with 4. So what does that mean in terms of the number of offers that we need to make? Well, it's a 9 to 10 relationship, which is 0.90. So if we take the 4 that we want to end up with and we divide it by 0.9, that means that we've got to have 4.44 people with a 9 to 10 relationship to end up with 4. Now that doesn't make a whole lot of sense right yet because we're talking about fractions of people and we have to do some rounding along the way here. But with a ratio of 9 out of 10, for every 10 we make, 9 accept. If we need to have 4 ending up, we've got to start with about 4.5 because 1/10 of them won't accept the offer that we give them. So we hang on to this 4.44 for now. Then we move forward down the column, figuring out the next numbers. This number will get larger and larger until we get to the end, because remember, we have a whole bunch of applicants and only a few job offers. So this number is going to grow. Next, we take that 4.44 and we apply a 50% factor to it, which means that we take the 4.44 and we divide by 0.5, which is the same as multiplying by 2. 4.44 divided by 0.5 gives us 8.88. Now, we know, based on our relationships, that if we have 8.88 people at this point in the process, we will end up with 4, because those relationships have been established and they hold pretty true. How many background checks do we need to do? If we take our 8.88 and we're going to apply to it a 0.25 relationship, which is a 1 out of 4. So we're going to take that number and divide by 0.25. That means that at this stage of the process, we've got to have about 36 people, so that mathematically, as we move forward, we're going to end up with 4 total. All right, so now we've got a 35.55. We're going to have a 0.6 factor here, because that's 3 out of 5 is 0.6. Bring our 0.6 in and we divide 35.55 by 0.60. And that means that at this stage of the process, we've got to have 59, roughly 60 people in order to get 4 employees. The last 2 stages are that we've got a 0.2 relationship here, which is 1 out of 5. We bring that down and we say 59.26 divided by 0.20 gives us a number of 296.3. Now again, we don't have 296.3 people. You can't have a 0.3 person. So we're going to round that off, and we're going to say that based upon our established ratios of people who move from stage to stage in our process, we've got to start with 297 people if we want to end up with 4 when the process is done. So we would have 297 applications. We would end up, after we eliminate 4 out of 5, we keep 1 out of 5, we'd end up with about 60 people that have done the interviews. When that first interview is done, 1 out of 4 of those people will still be with us. So we've gone from 60 down to 36. When we then move to the next stage, we're going to have narrowed it from 35 to 8 or 9, and then we're going to, in the final stage, move this thing from 9 down to about 4.5, which then gives us 4 employees. Hopefully that kind of made sense. If you filled out your chart, you can go back to it and think through it, and hopefully it'll make a little bit more sense as we go through. One other thing that we want to try to work through here is a little bit of a different direction here. We have the same relationships, 9 out of 10, 1 out of 2, 1 out of 4, 3 out of 5, and 1 out of 5. So let's say that we want to do this not mathematically down the page, but in the form of a formula going out across the page. And if you remember your algebra, those of you who took algebra and said, I'll never use this, here we are using algebra. We set up a series of fractions with numerators and denominators. And as we lay this out, we want to make sure that as we move from left to right, as we build our formula across the page like this, that we want to keep alternating our numerators and our denominators so that we can later cancel them out. We start with the number of employees, and we know that we want to have 4 of them. Well, the first relationship that we have is employees to offers. So we're going to fill in, first of all, the employee to offer relationship. And we know that it's a 9 to 10. Because employees was in the numerator last time, it drops to the denominator now. So our 9 to 10 relationship is a 9 on the bottom and a 10 on the top. Later, we're going to be able to cross out our employees because there's 1 on the top and 1 on the bottom. And that would leave us with offers. And we want to continue to build out our formula here by, again, continuing to alternate the numerators and the denominators. We know that offers needs to go from the top to the bottom so that it will cancel out. And the relationship that we're showing is offers to background checks, and it's a 1 to 2 relationship. You see up here we have the 1 to 2 relationship, and that's represented by a 1 to 2 here. So the next stage in our calculation is going to move backgrounds to the bottom, and we know that backgrounds relate to second interviews at a 1 to 4 relationship. So when we move the background to the bottom, we put second interviews on the top. It's an established 1 to 4 relationship. So again, up here we started with 4 employees. we have 9 employees and 10 offers. So we put the employee down here, we bring in the offer, it's a 9 to 10. Offers to backgrounds is 1 out of 2, so 1 offer comes out of 2 background checks. The background checks is a 1 to 4 relationship with second interviews, so meaning we get a 1 background check out of 4 second interviews. The next thing we want to compare is second interviews to first interviews, and it's a 3 to 5 relationship. Second interviews will go to the bottom, first interviews will go to the top, and we know that it's a 3 to 5 relationship. The last thing that we're looking at is the relationship between first interviews and applicants. First interviews is going to be on the bottom, applicants is going to be on the top. It's a 1 to 5 relationship, and it would look like this. Hopefully that makes sense. Remembering that for this to work right, we got to keep alternating our numerators and denominators. Employees on the top, employees on the bottom. Offers on the top, offers on the bottom. Background checks on the top and on the bottom. Second interviews on the top and on the bottom. First interviews on the top and on the bottom. Applicants is all that's left. By the time we do our math, everything else will have canceled out and we'll end up with applicants. We started with employees, and based upon all the relationships, we've applied the staffing yields to end up with applicants. Now, what we do is we go through and we eliminate the common things. The employees cancel out, offers cancel out, backgrounds cancel out, second interviews cancel out, and first interviews cancel out. And we're going to end up, after doing all this math, with some number of applicants. What does that math look like? Well, it's 4 times 10 times 2 times 4 times 5 times 5. That's this. Over 1 times 9 times 1 times 1 times 3 times 1. 1 times 9 times 1 times 1 times 3 times 1. So that is the mathematical relationship. After we cancel out the words, we just look at the numbers going across. And what is 4 times 10 times 2 times 4 times 5 times 5? Well, 4 times 10 is 40, times 2 is 80, times 4 is 320, times 5 is 1,600, something like that. I hope I'm doing that right. And 1,600 times 5 is in the neighborhood of about 8,000. On the bottom, you're going to have 1 times 9 is 9, times 1 is 9, times 1 is 9, times 3 is 27, times 1 is 1. Math like that, you're going to have a calculator to help you with. You're going to get a calculator on your test. But when we do that math, we end up with an even 8,000 on the top and a 27 on the bottom. That 8,000 is 4 times 10 times 2 times 4 times 5 times 5. And that 27 is 1 times 9 times 1 times 1 times 3 times 1. So if you were to put a parenthesis around this and a parenthesis over here, multiply all those together, you get the top number. Multiply all those together, you get the bottom number. And now all we do is take the 8,000 and we divide by 27. That comes to 297. Well, that's interesting because on the last slide, when we worked through it, you remember out here, taking a number divided by 0.25, divided by 0.8, whatever, we came up with 297 at the bottom. So we've gotten the same answer twice. 297 applicants is what we need if we want to end up with 4 employees. Whoop. That's the individual staffing yields here. The hiring yield we haven't really talked about yet because we haven't known the numbers to calculate that. But we know that the hiring yield is the percentage or the ratio of people who finish as compared to the people who started. And we know that 4 people finished, right? 4 people got hired. And we know that 297 people started or applied. So 4 hired over 297 applied is a ratio, as we simplify this, of 1 to 74. And that means that 1.35% of the people who apply for our teller jobs actually get hired. Our hiring yield is 1.37. You might want to watch this video twice because there's a lot of information there. It's a lot of math. A lot of people aren't really comfortable instinctively with math, so working through this a couple of times is going to be really helpful. For test purposes, what I'm going to do is to give you a scenario, not with 6 steps or whatever, but maybe 3 or 4 steps that says, 1 out of 4 people who apply get invited to an interview, and 2 out of 3 people who get an interview get a background check, and 1 out of 2 people who get the background check done get offered, and 8 out of 9 who get offered get hired. And you just need to go through and figure out what the formula looks like here, putting the alternating labels, employee, employee, offer, offer, background, background, and then filling in the relationships. The relationship of 9 to 10 and 1 to 2 and 1 to 4. There's 9 to 10, 1 to 2, and 1 to 4. 3 out of 5, 1 out of 5, 3 out of 5, and 1 out of 5. Crossing these things out, doing your math, you would know that the staffing yield for a particular relationship is given as 9 out of 10 or 3 out of 5. You can calculate both the number of applicants needed and the hiring yield by looking at the ending figure, comparing it to the starting figure. So 4 hired out of 297 who applied is a 1.35%. It's a 1 to 74 ratio, and it's 1.35%. Keep clicking on the wrong slide here. Whew, that's actually kind of fun to do in class because we can take our time, we can go slow, I can look at faces and see who is confused, and I can adjust. I can go back and I can talk about things that folks need to get clarification on. I can't do that when I'm doing a video that you're going to watch, so it may be that you have to watch this a couple of times. This is something that an HR person would want to know how to calculate because it may be very, very legitimate that the accounting manager says, I need to have one really good accounts receivable clerk. How many people do I need to try to get to interview? And we'd say, well, you mean to apply? And we can calculate the number. To end up with one, traditionally, as people move through this process, how many do we have to have start? And we can figure those things out. Maybe for some really progressive organizations, they actually have databases or folders or something with different jobs with the staffing yields built in and the hiring yield calculated, so that when we want to hire 2 customer service reps, we go find a file on the computer or in the filing cabinet and pull it out for customer service reps and says, okay, if you need to hire 2, we got to start with 79 or whatever the case may be, because these are the relationships of how people move through the process. Again, you may need to watch this thing twice to really understand what we're talking about. If you've made good notes on your little worksheet form and filled it out as we went, maybe all you got to do is look back through that and kind of restate in your own words what a particular number means. Hey, that's the staffing yield of this step related to that step, or whatever the case may be. Maybe you need to explain it to somebody else so that you make sure that you understand why we put some numbers on the top and some numbers on the bottom, and why it's one under 4 rather than 1 over 4, because we're trying to cancel out those labels. At any rate, that's kind of what you probably will need to know from this particular part of the chapter, and we'll let it lie here. And if you have questions, let me know. But otherwise, put that thing in your toolbox so that you can be a more effective HR manager when it comes to hiring and staffing. And with the next series of videos, we will begin a new chapter, and we'll break it apart and try to make sure that we understand it. Hope things are going well, and bye for now.